You know, we think about public libraries, including the one that we're sitting in here today, as places of education and culture that are open to all, among the most democratic institutions in our society. Professor Knott helps us to understand that in the pre-civil rights America, and in the South in particular, there was a massive exception, as millions of African Americans were excluded from their communities' white libraries. For librarians like Cheryl and I, we understand library segregation as undermining intellectual freedom in America's public libraries more than any other factor in the 20th century. But the history of segregation and civil rights in public libraries also has been a significantly undertold story in the larger struggle for social justice in America. Imagine barring citizens from public library, forbidding their access to the knowledge that they need to learn and to improve their lives solely on the basis of their race. So I was delighted, and hope you are, that our jury selected Cheryl Knott and her Not Free, Not For All Public Libraries in the Age of Jim Crow for a 2016 Lillian Smith Book Award. Dr. Knott is an associate professor at the School of Information at the University of Arizona. Her book helps us to understand how Southern public libraries developed in a pattern dictated by a segregated society and the ways in which African Americans pushed against the weight of institutionalized racism to create educational opportunities for themselves and for their children. Cheryl, I'm grateful to you for writing the book, and I am proud to award to you a 2016 Lillian Smith Book Award.
Well, I want to say thank you to the Southern Regional Council, to President Charles Johnson, to the chair of the selection committee, Mary Twining Baird, and to all of the selection committee members. This award means a lot. Sorry. That was the part I wasn't going to do. Okay, sorry. And I'm also just especially thrilled to be able to get the award presented by Toby, who has been an inspiration to me. His own work has on segregated libraries in Alabama has won numerous awards, and it's really his interest in the sort of shifting sands of information access that continued to motivate me as I was working on this book. And I also am especially pleased to be able to accept the award the same year that Dr. Morrison is receiving one of numerous awards for his books. I was happy when I read his preface where he talked about this massive work taking 15 years to do. My own work took longer than that to bring into print. And yet, in his 15-year time period, he also wrote, like another book. So, I need to get busy, right? I'm truly inspired by the people that I've met and who are involved in this book festival and this book award. I think of everyone here as readers. And when I'm writing, I think of scholars like Dr. Morrison and Dr. Graham, who have set a very high bar. And, so it's their fault it took me so long. But there's another category of reader represented by everyone in this room, and those are the people who are here at the Decatur Festival of Books. These are the readers who are committed to the life of the mind. And many, of course, are active public library users as well as festival goers. We love, those of us who use public libraries, we love to read and reflect and enjoy. But I think we may sometimes take public libraries for granted. We don't think of their histories, of their past practices and policies. The last time I went to the Houston Public Library to use the archives to do some double checking on some of the records regarding the Carnegie Colored Library, as it was called. The library was celebrating with an exhibit, celebrating the founding of the library. So front and center in this exhibit was a huge photographic print of the women who had taken a leadership role in transforming an existing private fee-based collection into an important public library in a major city. They were instrumental in securing Carnegie funds for a building and in convincing city officials to earmark tax money for maintenance of that building and the collection. The exhibit was in the lobby of the library between the front door that I walked in, the sort of outward-facing part of the library, and the archive where the records were stored and somewhat protected, somewhat hidden. The exhibit was in a position so that you had to walk through it to get to the archives reading room. And as I walked past this huge photo of these white women in the 1890s, to get to the archives, it struck me as ironic, in effect, that they stood between me and this archive, this hidden record. Now, there's no question that these women accomplished something significant and major. They created a municipal institution that still exists today, that serves its community well, and that is important. And they did that 20 years before they had the right to vote. At the same time, I think they missed an opportunity, to put it in the most charitable way possible, to acknowledge and support a key American value, and that is information access. Their library, like so many across the South, including in Atlanta, was not open to African Americans. Houston's African Americans went 10 years more without access to a public library, and then lived 40 years with segregated branches and small collections. And it was at the initiative of African Americans that the library system finally desegregated. I grew up in Houston. I didn't learn that the library I grew up loving was part of a segregated system until I was in my 30s and had moved far away. In fact, it was a mention somewhere that set me on the path of learning more about this system, not only in Houston, but in lots of other southern places. As one of my colleagues said, I was attempting to do local history in a lot of different locales. But I think it's important to learn from the past, not only to try to not make the same mistakes, but also to help us think critically about our own practices and policies in the present. When I began this work, it never occurred to me that I would spend so many years trying to document and tell this story. And it never occurred to me that Not Free, Not For All would be given the Lillian Smith Book Award. So, had I foreseen that award coming, had I foreseen having this wonderful day, maybe I would have written a little faster. So thank you. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to the Southern Regional Council and your partners. I really appreciate it from the bottom of my heart.
Well, as was said, we have time for some questions. If anyone has any questions for our authors, I'm sure they'll be glad to entertain them. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, with the public
Thank you for your question. I do think there is a story there to be told. And very briefly in the book, I tried to address that slightly. And I think the key, or at least part of it, is residential segregation. So this interest that librarians had in reaching out to communities and building branches so that people didn't have to always go to the main library downtown. It was a great idea on paper, and it works really well, except that as long as there's residential segregation that's enforced by city policies and ordinances, as well as practices, it makes the branch library part of the system of segregation. So I did look a little bit at some of the northern cities and what people were talking about, and there's an interesting dialogue about, on the part of white librarians, saying, you know, in northern cities, well, we don't have segregated branches here, but the Negro branch in this neighborhood. So that's why I think there's more to that story. So there is a difference, obviously, between the official and the actual.
But before you leave, please hand the product of the so-called segregated libraries. Did you pay attention to the relationships of the librarians who happen to have been African American made within their communities and the positive aspects? I became a librarian because of an African American library in Meridian, Mississippi, Carnegie Library, built on the property of my home church. So segregation isn't always bad. And so I'm wondering, did you see those positive aspects?
I did, and can I interview you later? And, you know, in another 15 years, your story will come out, or 20 in my case. Yes, and that's one of the paradoxes about the story, right, is that there's networking not only within local communities, but across communities among African American librarians who were meeting together sometimes on the campus of Prairie View A&M College or other places. So they were networking with each other. They were supporting their communities. They, over time, began to really build collections as the publishing world began to produce more books by and about African Americans. Those librarians brought those books into their communities. So thank you so much for asking that question, because it's a very important part of the story.
Or relationships with what was happening in the library?
Just a very quick note. Booker Washington was very important to the establishment of many libraries, and his book, Up From Slavery, was a critical text for both Andrew Carnegie, who learned about Washington's work that way, and also for Rosenwald, who learned about his work that way and became interested in his story. So I think he's remarkably important on many different levels, and he was also he was right there because his network was so vast. He was right there, for instance, in Houston. It was his intervention that helped create the library that was available for African Americans there. The first Carnegie-funded library building for African Americans was at Tuskegee. So.
Before you have to see that, the connection between the schools and libraries, for me, is very important, because the only access to the library I had was at the school.
Right.
And so I cannot remember, and I am from the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis's last stand, as it were. And I remember very distinctly as I walked to my segregated school, I had to pass that library that became known for vertical integration. And there was a historical marker reminding us that this was the home of the last Confederacy. I do not remember any use of libraries other than at my schools. Later, the bookmobiles came around. But there was connection. That's the only access I had was through school.
Well, just quickly, the Rosenwald schools were among one of the most important sites for libraries, and it echoes what Professor Morrison has already said, and that is the idea that this desire on the part of whites to use spaces that already existed rather than construct new spaces. So the Rosenwald schools became sites of libraries, particularly in more rural areas, and particularly in the late 20s, early 30s. So thank you for that comment. It rings very true.
Dr. Knott, while you're here, could I ask one quick question? I'm also a product of one of those segregated systems, and I went this way. I also grew up, the only library that I really utilized, they probably thought I lived there, was in the school. But my question to you is, and maybe you can see your book, I look forward to reading it. In later times, another form of segregating readers was something that I encountered by librarians telling me, well, no, I don't have that, you can't use that, that's a reference book. Particular books that I was interested in. Did you find any of this, and have you addressed this in your book?
I'm trying to think about my book. Did I address? I don't know that I have an instance of that. Did I? Okay, then. Earlier today, I introduced myself twice to Charles Johnson. And he was very gracious and said both times he was happy to meet me, so thank you. I do know of cases where, particularly in the later times, when it was clear that the segregated library system was not going to stand much longer, where African Americans would start testing. They'd go to the circulation desk, they'd find a book, they'd see what would happen. And oftentimes they were told, well, there's a branch library for you to use, and you should go there. And if the person said, well, this book isn't at that branch library, they would be told, well, you go there and we'll send the book over. So what the kinds of things that you're talking about are part of a longer, I think we were talking about this earlier, more widespread practice of information access denial that involved, that put people in a situation where they had to use subterfuge or disassembling to try to get access to books.